Welcome to a Steamforged Games video. I'm your host Jamie, and we are joined in the studio today by the illustrious guest, Ian Livingstone.
Hi.
How did you get into the world of tabletop gaming and RPGs?
Well, I was a big board games player at school, and I played chess for the school and Monopoly all the time. And I used to play with two old school friends, Steve Jackson and John Peake, and we went our separate ways after school. And when we moved to London, we met back up again and shared the same flat and had pretty boring paid jobs and decided to play lots of board games by way of recreation. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could somehow turn our hobby into some sort of business? So we decided to publish a fanzine called Owl and Weasel, and we sent it out to everybody we knew in games. And one of the recipients was a gentleman called Gary Gygax, who lived in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And he just invented this game called Dungeons and Dragons, and he sent us a copy. Steve and I became completely obsessed with it, and John not so much. So we ordered 6 copies, and on the back of that order we got an exclusive distribution agreement for 3 years for the whole of Europe, and that really was the beginning of Games Workshop. So we started selling it mail order, and see people milling around on the streets outside looking for this Games Workshop. Wasn't there. Of course, it was an apartment and people coming up and down the stairs all the time. We didn't have a phone in our flat. Clearly, decades before mobile phones were invented, we used to share a phone on the public payphone on the ground floor with our landlord, and he always used to hang up on all our customers who were phoning up. And that's really how we started playing role-playing games in particular. Became absolutely obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons.
So I guess you could say you and Steve are responsible for bringing role-playing games to the UK.
Yeah, it was a trickle at first. The workshop was tiny, and we were also big board games players, and we wanted to build up this kind of games community. So we were selling D&D through our small fanzine, Owl and Weasel, and we thought, wouldn't it be great, we should go over to the States. And good timing, because we actually got kicked out of our flat by our landlord, who got fed up with all these parcels and people arriving. So we went to Gen Con 9 in 1976, met Gary Gygax and signed up all the fledgling games companies, got the UK distribution rights for them all, and came back to the States, back from the States, and had nowhere to live, had very limited cash, and went to the bank manager and said, hello, we've got this great game, it's a role-playing game which you kill monsters and find treasure and go on these fantastic journeys of the mind. And he looked at you as rather like a dog watches television. He had no understanding whatsoever and kicked us out. So we ended up having to rent a tiny office at the back of an estate agent to run Games Workshop. And we were obliged to live in a van for 3 months, which we parked next to the squash club, which we joined so we could have a shave and a shower in the mornings. And also got good at squash by default, and then back into our tiny office to do all our mail orders. But in those days, in the 70s, we were living the dream. We were forging our own destiny, and it was amazing. And word of mouth spread, and suddenly, there's lots of people coming to buy D&D, and we're doing loads of mail order. And that's when we opened our first shop in 1978, and there was a huge queue outside the moment we did that.
Yes, I believe that's the shot on your Twitter account, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It's a huge queue, and we were just kind of knocked over by that, and it was the first one of many.
And how do you feel seeing the gaming community flourish, and why do you think it's taken off?
Well, we started with Workshop trying to find, make or play games that we actually wanted to enjoy for ourselves, and it just so happened that we realized that it wasn't only us who wanted to play these kinds of games, there was other people. It's just that there weren't the games there, and if there were, how do you get hold of them? So fast forward to where we are today, and there's a huge industry that's built up, both in board games, RPGs, miniatures, and video games, of course. And I think it's because we're playful by nature as human beings, and there has to be something for everybody. It can't be just kind of boring board games where you just roll a dice and move around a board. That's okay for those people who want to play those. Nothing, not criticizing, but it's not I want to play. And I think there are far more gamers in this world than people imagine, and I think the demand is finally being satisfied with products that they actually enjoy playing. So whether it's Workshop or Steamforged for playing the games that they produce, or video games or board games, as at Spiel, Essen last weekend, 200,000 people turned up, 1,500 new games were released.
Incredible.
Perhaps too many, but nevertheless showing the state of the industry today.
You've been involved in so many tabletop projects. What's been your favourite?
I mean, that's a bit like saying, what's my favourite child? and I've got 4 of them, and no, I don't have a favourite. So, I mean, there's been some big moments in my life. Obviously, starting Games Workshop was an amazing thing for us, and we were just very fortunate to have been able to turn our hobby into what became a hugely successful business. And then seeing our Fighting Fantasy game books being published in the 80s, seeing the Warlock Fights Up Mountain on the shelves in W.H. Smith was quite a big moment. And then, of course, I moved into video games and launched Tomb Raider, Lara Croft, and that was another big moment. And it's very difficult.
A rich tapestry in history.
Look, I'm a games player. I'll never retire. Work and play is the same for me.
So how did you hear about us? How did you hear about Steamforged Games?
Steamforged was brought to my attention through the video games industry. I was aware, of course, of Dark Souls, and I was told, hey, there's an amazing board game that's been made with the Dark Souls license. So I checked it out, and kind of my interest grew. And there's always been this niggling thing in the back of my head, how to get more back into physical stuff.
Yep.
And so, I think I wrote to Steamforged, and we started a dialogue, and over time it just seemed to make sense if I could try and help with some of my long experience, help the company on its way, because they're doing an amazing job thus far.
You're the non-executive director of Steamforged Games, so what does that mean, and what will you be doing next with Steamforged?
Well, as a non-exec director, you attend board meetings, usually monthly, and you get the CEO to report on the past month's performance, and from the Chief Financial Officer to report on the numbers, and also to start looking into the future and looking at costs and revenue streams in a quite formal way. But what I enjoy the most, of course, is advising on products and on strategy, trying to find products going to resonate with a wider audience, and how we're going to achieve getting into new markets, trying to create differential products. For me, a good game is always the starting point. I don't like to attach myself to good games that are Me Too products, or have just taken a license just to sell something which is an average product. So the product has to be as good, even if it has a license to attach to it. So it's looking at new ways of entertaining tabletop gamers in imaginative ways.
And what upcoming Steamforged releases are you most excited about?
There's a couple of projects I've been told about, but I'm not sure I'm allowed to say at this moment in time because they haven't been announced. God tier, I'm looking excited about seeing it everywhere, and I'd just like to see some more products come my way so I can play them as well.
Obviously, the industry's changed a lot since you started with Games Workshop. How do you think it's changed?
The fact that games has become almost socially acceptable.
That's the term I say. Like, games are now socially acceptable. You can bring a game out and you won't be lambasted for as being a nerd. Get back in your basement, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, play is natural, and it's how when we first enter the world as babies, we interact, we learn through play, and I don't think we should ever stop playing. Play fulfills. It helps define us as who we are as human beings, and around a tabletop, that kind of group experience, friendly battles and making deals and backstabbing and banter and that sort of theatre that's created around that. I think it's a great thing to do, and I think more people should do it. In fact, I want the whole world to play games.
And if somebody wanted to get into the sphere of tabletop gaming industry and everything it encompasses, how easy would you say it is to do that?
It's ironically, in this age of the internet, I would say it's even easier than ever before to get into making physical games. First and foremost, I know Steamforged are very successful in this area is through crowdfunding. Kickstarter is a platform that allows anyone to make a game. Back in the old days, as it were, unless you were a large organization with lots of capital and distribution channels and publishing and the ability to export, it was very difficult for small companies to get to market, because they had to not only build the physical inventory and stock, they then have to get it into retail, and they had to go through the gatekeepers of will the buyers take it or not, will it be sold if it's in the shops. Sometimes they don't, they got them back. Or if you like a one-man band, you print 5,000 copies and end up with 4,999 in your garage because you didn't have to get rid of them. But with Kickstarter, of course, it's effectively a pre-sale. It's the market telling you whether or not your idea is any good, and therefore you can completely pay for your product before you've had to pay for the content. So that is an amazing opportunity for anyone to take advantage of, and board games done particularly well.
Where do you see the tabletop gaming industry going forwards, and what challenges do you reckon we'll face?
Well, I think it's certainly bound to grow. Even though it's been through a huge growth period in the last few years, there's been a revival in board games and tabletop games in particular. There's still a huge amount of areas for expansion. There are still a lot of people who don't know what these games and what these products are. There's countries that don't even know what they are. So there's an enormous upside, because we all know that these games are enjoyed by a lot more people than they think.
I just wanted to touch on something you said earlier about growing up with games. You're a co-founder of the British Games Institute. Do you reckon there's scope for a similar organisation in the tabletop gaming industry?
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing stopping the board games industry and tabletop industry coming together to create an institute or even a trade body. And the public-facing part of the BGI, the British Games Institute, is the National Video Games Museum in Sheffield. And there you can see and play and learn and understand that the social, cultural, and also the economic impact of the video games industry. And it adds a certain credibility to the industry as well, and kind of demystifies it for some parents who are often worried that their children are playing games. And I would argue they should not be worried. They should be happy that they're playing games, because games, I think, are a contextual hub for learning. You learn about problem solving, learning intuitively, being able to fail in a safe environment, understanding partnerships and management and deals, and there's kind of enormous meta skills you can learn through playing games. So I think the power of play is really important, and if you can demonstrate that through a museum or an institute, happy days.
Touching on video games, how have tabletop games influenced video games and vice versa? And as video games have become more advanced, have tabletop games taken cues from that?
I think board games certainly had an influence on early games design. A lot of video games, I think, were seen as being, they were limited by the horsepower of the early PCs. But the game mechanics have come from board games and play in general. But they've adapted those and innovated those, and video games has split away from board games in many respects, but they've also come together in many ways as well. That fact that you can get board games based on video games and video games based on board games and conversions. I don't think one is growing at the expense of the other. I think they're both growing, and there's going to be more and more collaboration.
Having worked on both tabletop and video game franchises, what are your thoughts on the popularity of both formats of gameplay, and how has it fluctuated over the years? The big call for me was in the 80s when the choose-your-own adventure games and D&D were demonized.
I think the games has always suffered from a poor image in the media. Final Fantasy game books, when they were launched in the 80s, there was an 8-page warning guide published by the Evangelical Alliance saying because children are interacting with ghouls and demons, they're bound to get possessed by the devil. A woman in deepest suburbia phoned a local radio station and said, having read one of my books, her son levitated. The local vicar threatened to chain himself to the railings of Penguin books until they were banned. There were petitions sent in saying that children's imaginations are going to be corrupted by Final Fantasy game books. And then we get into board games, as you mentioned, Dungeons and Dragons, all the hysteria around that, because of people thought they would end up devil worshipping because you were playing games that had chaos undead in them. Video games, of course, has been a slow-moving target for all parts of the media, saying it poisoned children's minds, blaming all sorts of ills of the world on video games, without thinking for 1 second all the positive things that can happen from playing games. As I was talking about, this sort of cognitive activity and problem solving and meta skills that you can get from playing games, and creativity from playing games like Minecraft, where you're building these wonderful 3D architectural worlds and sharing with your friends. And the same for board games and tabletop games. And people don't understand the value of that community, sharing, playing, painting, planning, strategy. These are all good for your mind, so play on. It's okay, kids, you'll be fine. And any parents out there are worried, start playing yourselves.
I just want to take a moment to formulate the question. Kids today seem to have a lot of screen time, as do grown-ups. Do you credit the growth of the tabletop games to people wanting to get away from their screens, to have face time with other people? Not just because their favourite video games are board games like Horizon Zero Dawn and Resident Evil, but because they actually want that social interaction?
I think it's not only in games where you're seeing a revival of the analog world. Vinyl's become popular again in music. Physical books have been popular when everyone used to talk about ebooks and Kindle's going to dominate the world. And of course, board games have seen a huge revival. And I think it's not a question of want to take a break. I think if you live your whole world in digital, you're kind of missing something. Your kind of soul craves something physical. And so it's nice to grab a part of the real world, which is a board game, and play that with friends around a table and see them in the room. That's not saying video games are losing favour, not at all. But I'm just thinking people like to do both. For the last 20 odd years, until recently, there haven't been enough quality board games, I would argue, for the video game to turn the heads of the video gamers. But now there's this huge rise of titles and quality of games that are available, so people can do both. They can play great video games and great board games and tabletop games.
What lessons could the tabletop industry learn from the video game industry?
I think there's a tendency in video game development that I've seen over the years that people tend to overcomplicate games for no reason other than to impress their peers in the development studio. And so you've got, for me, a great game involves a game that is really easy to learn but difficult to master. Do that and create original IP with compelling gameplay, ease of access, and that little bit of magic fairy dust to make you want to come back and back and back over and over again. The game has to be compelling in multiple ways. You don't be bored at any time. I think video games in the early days, again, used to be too long. And because developers thought you need to make it, 20 hours long, or people feel cheated. But if a lot of that experience is boring, it's pointless. You never hear anyone coming out of a film saying, pretty rubbish film, or at least it lasted 20 hours. You want 2 hours of intense pleasure. And therefore, I think games, people should concentrate on the fun that you have in a shorter period of time. I think it's one of the things you take out of video games development.
Okay, this one's a bit more of a personal question, but I'm starting my very first Dungeons and Dragons campaign on Saturday. So I was wondering, have you ever been a game master or dungeon master?
Oh, I've been a dungeon master and a player, of course, and of course I've effectively written dungeons with Final Fantasy game books. Death Trap Dungeon, for example, the clue is in the title. So what I like doing is luring people to their death, promising untold riches and rewards only for them to fall on poison spikes. So my joy is to trick people into doing the wrong thing, thinking they're doing the right thing. So yeah, a bit of a cruel player, but doing it in a very happy way. As a player, I was always a bit of an aggressive kind of barbarian thug. Large sword, small mind.
And I've got one last question, and it was about Fighting Fantasy. Have you ever cheated?
I don't tend to read Fighting Fantasy game books. I write them, but I know everybody who does play them cheated. When they were out in the 80s, I used to see people on public transport everywhere with their hands in fingers in multiple pages. I used to call it the 5-fingered bookmark.
Yes.
Peeking around the corner, taking a look, call it what you like. It's cheating, but I really don't mind if I just want people to enjoy the experience, and if that involves cheating, who cares?
Thank you, Ian, for your time today. I've enjoyed it, and I hope everybody at home has as well. And we'll see you again soon.